Welcome to this special Gastro Girl podcast. This episode was produced in collaboration with the American College of Gastroenterology's Patient Care Committee. Here's your host, Jacqueline Gollin.
Well, hello, everyone. Today we're talking about a topic that you may think is totally unrelated to gastroenterology, but guess what? It can be a serious contributing factor to your overall digestive health and well-being. The topic is sleep. Yes, sleep. I have invited Associate Professor of Neurology, Dr. Cathy Goldstein from Michigan University Sleep Disorders, to help us understand how sleep or lack of sleep is connected to your GI health. We're so excited to have you here. Welcome, Dr. Goldstein.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. And let's get started. First of all, I've been stalking you on social media, and that's how we discovered your great work. So we were so excited when you agreed to participate. I know it's taken a while to get you scheduled, but here you are. So, we gotta get started. So I'm always interested in learning, first of all, how a physician finds their specialty and what led you to specialize in neurology, and more specifically, the study of sleep.
So absolutely. I love neurology. So my undergraduate is in mathematics, and I love math and I love deductive reasoning. And so when I went to medical school, I obviously fell in love with neurology, where a patient presents with a problem, and knowing what you know about the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, where what controls what parts of the body and sensation and image perception, all of those things allows you to figure out where the problem in the nervous system was. But the only problem was, in a lot of neurology, the disorders cause significant difficulties to people's quality of life. They can be fatal. And oftentimes we don't have great treatments, especially for some of the really, really high morbidity disorders like ALS. So I found myself wanting to do more primary care, more preventative medicine. And that's how I got into sleep, because we can really, really make a difference in people's health and how they feel on a day-to-day basis, and way down the road by improving their sleep.
Well, this is great. And it's really fascinating how you came to this topic, to this area of specialization. And the math thing is so cool. Who would have thought deductive reasoning and medicine? But it makes a lot of sense, right? It totally makes sense. So maybe you can help our listeners understand, first of all, the basic components of sleep. What is a good sleep? What is the circadian rhythm? It's something we hear a lot about, but maybe we don't really understand it. We kind of think we do. It's not really a rock and roll kind of thing, right? It's really important. It's really an important part of our sleep cycle. And, so here we go. What is it? Where do we start?
Yeah, so talking about sleep, the best way to get that conversation started is to discuss the control of sleep. And there's a two-process model that regulates our sleep. So the homeostatic sleep drive, or what I like to think of as the hourglass, and then the internal clock or circadian rhythm. So starting with our homeostatic sleep drive, this can be thought of kind of as sleep hunger. So the more you sleep, the less tired that you are, and the more sleep deprived you are, the more easily you're going to fall asleep. However, if we just went on the homeostatic sleep drive, do you know how we would sleep? We'd sleep in 2 to 3 hour bouts across the 24-hour day. So you'd sleep a couple hours, wake up, build up that homeostatic sleep drive, and then you would fall asleep again for a couple hours, wake up, and that obviously doesn't work well with human life, and particularly our light-dark cycle. And circadian rhythms are these endogenous, near 24-hour oscillations in virtually every bodily process that we have. And the likely reason we're evolved to have these is to anticipate and optimally respond to the light-dark changes that are due to the Earth rotating on its axis every 24 hours. And the way these interact is when you wake up in the morning. Ideally, you've slept all night because you've been listening to all this great content and you know you need it. You've been consuming all this health media. So you've slept 8 hours, you wake up, your homeostatic sleep drive is low because you're sleep replete. Now, throughout the day, your homeostatic sleep drive is going to grow and grow and grow. So to assist with you making it to the dark period, your circadian alerting signal grows in opposition. And we actually have a time, so around people with a normal circadian rhythm, where we call the forbidden zone for sleep, where their circadian alerting system has overshot the homeostatic sleep need so much that you cannot fall asleep at this time. And it's typically around 9 p.m.-ish in people with normal circadian entrainment. And it's where our patients with insomnia always like to lay down and try and go to sleep. And we know people cannot sleep at this time because even though they've been awake all day, your circadian alerting drive, independent of your sleep, is super high. People often refer to this as a second wind.
Yeah. So what, I'm not going to confess to my circadian rhythm being a little off balance these days, because I think I definitely want to hit the sack about 9 p.m. But seriously, what is a normal, or I shouldn't say normal, but what is a healthy, or what is the optimal wake period and sleep period for an average person who's not working the night shift or something like that?
Yeah, so your circadian phase, or how your internal clock aligns with the 24-hour day, is driven by your genetics. And some people are early and some people are later. But for normal adults, right after that forbidden zone for sleep, so around 9 p.m., that's when the onset of your melatonin secretion begins. And it peaks about 2 to 3 hours earlier than your natural rise time, which we would say a natural rise time would be kind of how you let people sleep if they didn't have to wake up for work. So we would say that's about 7 to 8 a.m. And so that melatonin peaks 2 to 3 hours before then, along with a nadir in your core body temperature. And that's actually the lowest point of alertness in your day. So for people with a normal or average circadian rhythm, their lowest point of alertness is around 4 a.m., 5 a.m. So that's where you hear the term 4 a.m. courage come from. People are different though. So because of your genetics, there's some people who are earlier and there's some people who are set later, and we call that chronotype. So morning larks have an early circadian clock. They prefer falling asleep early and also waking up early. And night owls, they don't really want to elicit sleep until much later, and they do better when they fall asleep or when they can sleep in later. And if we could live in accordance to our clock, people would be probably much better off. But unfortunately, we have expected kind of time constraints, early to bed, early to rise, tenets like that, that for many people kind of go against their internal clock. And we actually found with social isolation, there was a lot of work in the field that showed that people were sleeping longer and more consistently when they didn't have to get up early to commute.
That's interesting. So is it still what we always hear, 8 hours of sleep, no matter where you fall in that circadian rhythm, whether you're early or late, it's just to have 8 hours? Is that still
Yep. So most adults do need 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And again, that should be timed at the point when your circadian system promotes it. So for most people, that's a bedtime of around 11 p.m. and a rise time of 7 to 8 a.m.
So that's great. So now that we understand a little bit of how the circadian rhythm works, and those of you who get up early and go to sleep early and vice versa. So what are some of the common sleep disorders that occur? And I'm going to ask you this question before we get into how is it impacting our digestive health?
Yeah. So a few different things. So the main thing that we take care of in the sleep disorders clinic, because it's so common and it does require medical intervention most of the time, is obstructive sleep apnea. And what obstructive sleep apnea is repetitive closure of the upper airway, typically behind the roof of the mouth or behind the tongue. And when your airway obstructs like that during sleep, your lungs don't fill with air completely, your oxygen levels drop, and your brain wakes up to resume ventilation. And this can happen over and over again at night. You won't notice all the awakenings, but what happens is people, even if they're trying to get enough hours logged in the bed, they feel sleepy the next day. And we know this increases the risk of diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, maybe even dementia down the road. And it makes people feel very sleepy and can increase your risk of accidents that are fatal up to 6-fold. So a really important problem.
So how do people know if they have that obstructive sleep apnea? Is there
So
like, do they?
obstructive sleep apnea is typically on a continuum with snoring. So snoring shows us that the upper airway is too relaxed, so it vibrates as the air is coming in at night. And then with obstructive sleep apnea, it goes a step further and actually closes off. So things like snoring, waking up frequently to use the bathroom, daytime sleepiness and fatigue, a bed partner who notices choking, gasping, or pauses in breathing, things like morning headaches, daytime dysfunction, dry mouth. Those are all possible indications that you have obstructive sleep apnea. This is something that's more common if you have upper airway anatomy that's crowded, so certain facial shapes, tonsils, or if body fat tissue, so obesity, is pushing on the airway or pushing on the chest wall, affecting the respiratory dynamics.
But that's really interesting. And you definitely want to speak to your doctor when you're experiencing that, or your partner knows that you're experiencing that.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about how sleep deprivation can impact someone who has chronic GI conditions, whether it's a condition like IBD or something, more common, for an average person with constipation or bowel regularity. What are some of the implications of not getting enough sleep?
So first, I always liked it when I talk to people about these things, I always like to go back to, firstly, because we hear so much in health media about this is associated with this is associated with that. If you had a red car in 1984, you're probably going to get X, Y, or Z, right? So I always like to think back to the why before we talk about the what. And so when you look at biological plausibility, we go back to these beautiful animal studies that people have done in their labs. And there's been a few interesting things involving sleep and circadian rhythms and the GI system. So for example, we talked about that central clock that kind of aligns our sleep and wake with the light dark cycle. That central clock is in part of the brain called the hypothalamus. However, that molecular clock machinery is all over our body, including our GI tract, our liver, and also the microbiome. And so those things can oscillate on their own. They're entrained not only by or aligned only by dark cycles that are abnormal or sleep-wake periods, but also directly by feeding. So if you eat at abnormal times, you can desynchronize your microbiome or the just functions of the GI tract in general. So that is one of the reasons that we think circadian disruption is a problem for GI disorders. And when there is circadian disruption, whether it's a clock gene abnormality or you take an animal and you shift their light dark cycle, the microbiome shifts to a more pro-inflammatory makeup of organisms. And so that's one of the indications too that this could be a problem. The other problem when we have these circadian abnormalities in animal studies is that the gut becomes more leaky, and particularly in the context of a challenge like alcohol, that gut leakiness related to circadian disruption can really cause problems. So if that's a circadian kind of mechanisms behind things, what are the sleep mechanisms? So when you don't get enough sleep, that's a pro-inflammatory state, and that's going to really affect the likelihood of any disorder. And the other thing that we notice is sleep is really integral in pain and our perception of pain. So if you're not sleeping well, any pain that you have from an underlying disorder, abdominal distension, anything like that is going to be magnified. With obstructive sleep apnea, it causes recurrent drops in your blood oxygen level. So again, inflammatory increases that are driving GI diseases, causing fat deposition in the liver, and also changing the pressure inside the chest cavity, which makes people more likely to have acid reflux. So there's a lot of different ways that either sleep that's poor in quality or associated with a disorder like sleep apnea and just circadian disruption, so getting light and dark at the wrong time, like shift work or recurrent jet lag, could increase the likelihood or the severity of things like IBD, liver disease, and IBS. And indeed, when you look at GI clinics, up to like 70% of individuals with IBS have poor quality sleep.
That's so interesting. And is sleep one of the areas which a doctor, probably you do, but are doctors commonly asking patients, GI patients, about their sleep patterns?
Well, fun fact, here at U of M, I'm actually married to a gastroenterologist. And
Oh,
I'm close
cool.
friends with a large portion of the department. So here we really have a great relationship between GI providers and sleep, and they're very quick to order sleep studies or refer and address the sleep issue. But I don't think that's the case across the board, and it really is important to ask. Particularly, what I find a lot of my patients who have concurrent GI disorders like IBS or IBD and sleep disorders, they tell me that the two kind of flare up together, that they have problems together, and it's, it is a chicken and the egg phenomenon, which is driving which, but it does show the importance of addressing the patient as a whole and thinking about how their disorders and their experiences are affecting each other.
It's funny you mentioned chicken and the egg, because if I could show you my screen right now, I have this chicken and the egg. Exactly the question I was going to ask is like, what comes first? Is it the GI disorder, the sleep, disruption? But it makes total sense. So absolutely agree that doctors should ask about sleep, but what can patients do? We're all about empowered patients. So how do you recommend the patient approach their healthcare provider with their, how do they bring up their sleep? Hey doc,
Yeah.
I'm worried about my sleep. Is this an impact? Like, what do you suggest? How can they bring up this topic with their doctors?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing is we want to make sure in our 24-hour crazy society, the first thing we want people to do is to start some self-care and see if that improves anything. So really paying attention to sleep hygiene, caffeine intake, what time they're eating, their light exposure at night, which moves our internal clock later and suppresses our own melatonin secretion. And my biggest one is getting up at the same time every single day, which is the best thing to align your circadian clock. So those are some things they can start to do. So now say you try and do those things and you're still sleepy during the day. You're still waking up a million times a night, or you're doing all this and you lay down to go to sleep and you're staring at the ceiling. That's something to bring to your doctor. And if your gastroenterologist isn't prepared to address that, bring that over to your primary care physician. And even if they're not addressing your GI disorder directly, they're addressing your sleep, I bet we'll see some dividends.
I love the term sleep hygiene. Can you talk? I was going to ask you for the tips. Like, what can we do to prepare our bodies, our rooms, our environments for proper sleep? And it's really hard in this day and age. We got, constant mobile devices, computers, TV screens, and what can we do to take proper care and proper sleep hygiene? What are some of the tips that you have for patients?
So humans form like really strong associations with things, right? Like you probably have cues in your environment that based on the time of day or what you're doing are going to make you feel hungry, even if you're not hungry, right? We just have that conditioned element of there's a cue and we have a physical response. Sleep is incredibly like that. So we want people to form an association with the bed and sleep and not conditioned arousal with the bed and being awake. So this kind of phrase, everyone says the bed is for the two S's only, sleep and sex. Where does that come from and why would that help? Because if you only sleep in your bed and have sex in your bed, what are the odds you're going to associate your bed with sleep? 1 and 2, right? If you sleep in your bed, have sex in your bed, are on your laptop in your bed, are fighting with your partner in bed, are doing your taxes in bed, like are scrolling through social media in bed, all of these different things are going to bring down the odds that your body is going to have the response of sleep in reaction to that cue of getting into bed. So that's the first thing. The bed is just for sleep. Some other things, your bed should be a sanctuary. If people are stressed out as it is, don't have items in your bedroom that are in your visual field that are going to stress you out. Like if you're somebody who works on something and you have stacks and reams of paper, those don't belong in the bedroom. Like try and shove like dirty, like laundry baskets, anything. Just really, really keep this like a calm, soothing environment. And the other thing is the temperature. So cool, high 60s temperature is always recommended for sleep. And people might ask why. The reason is as part of the natural process of falling asleep, your core body temperature cools down and you start losing heat through your skin and your extremities. And that process is associated with sleep onset. So if your bedroom is too hot, your body's going to do everything to bring that temperature down, and you're going to be uncomfortable and not fall asleep. Light and sound pollution are really rampant, particularly if you live in an urban environment. So I always like white noise. And if you do a fan, you get the white noise and the cooling property, but also really look for sources of light. Do you have light coming from a security lamp from the street that you need blackout shades? Do you have light indicators on electronics? Sound, I hope that everyone by now has their phone on do not disturb at night if it is in the bedroom environment, but make sure those vibrations, you might have a few nights of bad sleep, you finally fall asleep, and then that buzz goes off and you're wrecked. And we even know, like when they do experiments in the lab, they play like really quiet vibrations and tones, and that can wake people up in the EEG in their brainwaves. So make sure you're setting yourself up for success in your environment.
This is great. I hope our listeners can really take these tips seriously and enact them. And yeah, I really do. And if you're listening and you try this, write into us at podcast@gastrogirl.com and let us know how Dr. Goldstein's tips are working for you. And maybe we'll have you on as a guest too. And you can talk about how your sleep patterns have changed due to this podcast. But as we close this, did we miss anything important? Are there any more tips that you want to provide to patients or providers?
So this whole idea of consistency of sleep and really making sure your circadian rhythm is kind of aligned and not bouncing back and forth because you stay up till 2 a.m. on the weekends and sleep in, is really actually relevant for disease. So disease severity and IBD has been associated with people who have that irregular pattern where they prefer later bedtimes and wake times, and so push their clock later on the weekends. That actually has been associated with worse disease outcomes in addition to poorer quality of life. Because you did bring up this, is it the chicken or the egg? It makes sense if someone has a more severe disease state, their sleep's going to be worse, but sleep might, at least in part, be part of the chicken or the egg, however you take it, because when we follow these people with poor sleep or regular sleep patterns, they do have more problems down the road in relation to their inflammatory bowel disease. So I think that's something really, really important. And it just, we've really, as a society, really come to take our sleep for granted because we have little mini computers and mini suns that we can take into our bed with us. And it's easy to do. I get it, but try the simple things first. It's something you can change, and small changes can sometimes have a big impact.
Yeah. And what about little sleep rituals? Like either doing some guided meditations, or I love to listen to those and I fall asleep. And there's some wonderful meditations out there. And
absolutely, I recommend to almost all my patients who have trouble sleeping that they learn how to meditate. So first in general during the day, and then they use that technique at night, or they use the sleep stories, the sleep geared meditations. This is so good for two reasons. Meditation in general, we think is helpful for sleep, but also you mentioned a ritual, and a ritual, again, it's going to be another cue that, it's time for me to wind down. I'm getting in that bed. The bed is where I sleep and not watch TV. And that's another cue that helps people fall asleep.
And I just was thinking of one other thing, and, we're not going to bash any medicine or any product, but in terms of, people always think that something over the counter or even a prescription is going to solve their sleep issues. Generally, what are your views on these products, patients taking them or relying on them before they try some of these other things that you suggested?
So I've never seen a patient with insomnia that was secondary to a deficiency in diphenhydramine, which is what's in your over-the-counter PM formulations, or deficient in zolpidem, which is the generic for Ambien. Your body is biologically equipped to sleep. You just have to give it the right situation. And those medications have side effects. A lot of times the side effects are related to cognition and your thinking. So we really, really want to exhaust these behavioral things that we know are sleep promoting before we recommend medication. And melatonin, people say, well, it's natural. Your melatonin increase is what results in you falling asleep, but your body has melatonin. We make our own melatonin. We don't need to take it. The only time I really recommend melatonin is in shift workers, people with jet lag, or people with circadian rhythm disorders, and we give teeny tiny doses to adjust the clock. So behavioral interventions are really, really our go-to for sleep.
And the final question, and I'm sure you know this from just the last year or so with the pandemic, folks were really not, a lot of people weren't really taking good care of themselves as they normally would. We talked to some other experts who talked about increased alcohol use, people struggling with mental health challenges, depression, anxiety over the pandemic. And that probably really impacted sleep and behaviors. Do you have anything to say to those patients who are maybe struggling in the pandemic world with sleep because they're either relying on alcohol and it's causing other behavioral health issues?
So depression and anxiety in particular really go hand in hand with sleep, and sleep disturbance is often a cardinal feature of mental health problems, and it can oftentimes be hard to treat the depression or anxiety if the underlying sleep issue is not addressed. So these are things where medications may be indicated and you do need to see your doctor. But a note about alcohol is a coping mechanism. So alcohol interrupts the second half of the sleep period like crazy. So even if you don't go to bed intoxicated, if you're drinking earlier in the day, we know that people will have twice as much wakefulness if they drink alcohol at some point that day in that second half of the sleep period, which gets a lot of people. They say, I fall asleep great, but then I wake up and my mind is going, I can't get back to sleep. Alcohol is like throwing gasoline on that flame. So try and, if relaxation is what you need, got to start looking into some other things. And then we talk about a lot of what not to do, but what's the what to do? Exercise.
I was just going to say exercise. Yeah.
Exercise. Any exercise at all is good for your sleep. Exercise, particularly in the afternoon, or if you can do it in the morning and really get that light, if you can go outside and get light and activity, that's really going to help with your internal clock. And then exercise just in general is going to help promote slow wave sleep, which is that restorative sleep that really makes our memories consolidate. So definitely recommend exercise.
Well, this has been such a great conversation, Dr. Goldstein. We're so grateful to you. I hope our listeners really find it as powerful and helpful as I have. And again, thank you so much for your generous spirit and sharing all these great tips and insights with our listeners today. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Sleep well.
I hope so.
Thank you for listening to the Gastro Girl podcast. For more information and resources, please visit gastrogirl.com. Do you have a question for Gastro Girl? Please email podcast@gastrogirl.com. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in the Gastro Girl podcast are not a substitute for medical advice from your healthcare professional. Please consult a licensed clinician in your state regarding all matters related to your health.